I thought the best way to introduce Robin Walker to you, who was part of the practice that won the OIBA gold medal in 1974. Patrick Scott was awarded it. A particular kind of poignant moment in the relationships between Britain and Ireland. You can imagine there was... it was very important for Irish architecture that they were recognised by a country that they were in conflict with. And Claudia and I, through our friend Tom Dubois, found out about a house that Robin had built for himself and his family in West Cork on the Kenmare River, called Boabui, which means the Yellow Road in Irish, that you can actually go and stay in. And we went there, and it was an amazing experience, and it led to me then meeting Simon Walker, who's one of Robin's sons. He's an architect, and he teaches at the University of Limerick and at University College Dublin. And at one of his crits, I met Laura Evans, who's came then to London to work for us and is now an architect and runs a small practice in London and teaches at Kingston. And so we proposed, we had an exhibition about this house, and in particular the life of the house, which was very significant in Irish architectural culture, because Dorothy Walker had, in effect, established the Irish Arts Council and effectively brought modernism to this post-colonial situation. And she'd met Robin in Paris when he was working for Le Corbusier. He'd then gone to work, and he'd studied and then taught and worked with Mies van der Rohe in Chicago. And this house was a salon, especially for the first August bank holiday in Ireland. And a series of artists would come, Louis Le Brocqui, and then Seamus Heaney, who became a friend of the family, who they would make things and leave things in the house. So I knew this from reading Seamus Heaney's poetry, but I didn't know who An Architect was in the poem An Architect, which was written in memoriam of Robin. And I discovered that Sarah Walker, who's an artist who lives close by to the house, her son is called Seamus, and Seamus is the godfather. So the best way into this, we thought, was to make a film and to ask Seamus to read his poems. And so I thought the best way to introduce you to this topic is to show you this short film. So in lieu of having a book to show you, I thought I'd pass this around, which is the first in a series of books which I've edited, and I won't bore you with the details, but for some bizarre reason we ended up starting a publishing house, which is, I think the best thing is it's a lot more fun way to lose money than running an architecture practice. And you can the product is a lot faster to produce as well. And it's just basically all the books in the series are like this. And the first book we made was with the architect John Mounier, who's still alive. Changing the reality is slightly different, because obviously Robin's no longer here. But the template is this. And it's deliberately priced £25 to £30 so that students can afford to buy them. So I'll give you that. You can pass that around to people. Towards the end of the PhD that I kind of started in 1995, and I did an MPhil at Cambridge which ended up being about Baroque gardens and Baroque festival spaces and villas. And then 20 years later I finished it and was looking at the relationship between sculpture and geography, landscape art, and architecture, or the public realm as it's known by planners today. I started to write about late 20th century architecture and started to discover that despite the way in which the usual historiographies of modernity had emphasised the kind of heroic individual, and in fact Corbusier was kind of guilty perhaps in volume 6 of Vivre Complète with saying we don't need sculptors anymore, the architect is a sculptor, we don't need textile artists, the architect can do tapestries. In fact, there were a series of very close collaborations with landscape architects and artists, and in particular, I took what was supposedly the least iconic or the most aniconic situation in St. Peter's Clipland by Sigurd Leverance, and revealed that in fact it's full of these collaborative moments. So I kind of, by chance, kind of drifted into being a historian of late modernity. And I think it reminds me of conversations that I had, like when we were students at Cambridge. We were taught by a kind of generation of people who weren't very fashionable, because if you studied at Liverpool or Bath or places like that, you'd avoided the worst excesses of Peter Cook. Let's be precise. And instead, there was a living tradition of modern architecture that wasn't technocratic or wasn't technocratic. There were people like Michael Braun. And others who were interested in the city and in typology and in the history of architecture. So I've fallen into making a series of books which are effectively an attempt to recreate a link back to a generation of architects before us, and in doing so have found out that these people wrote a lot, that they weren't anti-intellectual technocrats as it suited the next generation of architectural polemicists like Bernard Tschumi and Rem Koolhaas and Charles Jenks to pretend, and that in fact there is a body of work, but a series of conversations at play, and so this is the Lives of Spaces exhibition, which I was kind of led to by instinct, but now that I've started this project of modern architecture and reflection, the format that we've evolved is that the writing of the architect foregrounds their own work. And then there's, and these are usually collaborative projects. So, in this case, Simon Walker, who's the son of the architect, is going to provide personal insights, and I counter that with a kind of slightly more outsider, objective, historical perspective, and then present the architect's writings, and then the projects, and then invite people working today to give a critical perspective of how this work might be seen as immediately relevant, which is why you can see towards the end there's Tom Dubois, Laura Evans, Doug Carson, Niall McLaughlin, and Elizabeth Hatz. I'm just going to show you a few pages from the book. When Subar made the film, she spent a few days in Burabui and took a series of photographs, and in the, last summer, we realised that as well as photographs of the house, she'd taken a series of photographs of the relationship between the beach, which was the basis of the economy of the fisherman's bothy, moving through this oak forest that was planted by the English to provide oak to make warships for the Armada, or after the Armada for the English Navy, and then the house. And so the structure of the book is kind of from the chthonic and the earthy and the natural towards this urbane, modern architecture of Robin Walker. In fact, this is a part of a piece of work that our students at UCD did, situating Ambod Falcha, which was the Irish tourist board, in relationship to the grid of the Georgian city. And in fact, it's absolutely mathematically embedded in the rhythm of the construction of the Georgian city. And my first impression was this kind of strange architecture I'd been to Porto quite a lot, and I felt like I'd stumbled across a lost North Atlantic seaboard form of vernacular modernism, which we know through the work of Fernanda Tavora and Caesar was a direct reaction to fascist classicizing tendencies of the Salazar government, and also a reaction against a kind of industrialized modernity. Now, Robin had this funny career. He was a very successful architect. The oil crash in 1974, which was kind of partly a function of the war between Israel and Egypt, kind of destroyed architectural production for a number of years in Western Europe. Robin became a teacher. He taught Neil, but he began to write, and he actually earned a living he was a planning inspector. And he wrote this sort of very strange text. This is a kind of, I don't think he was aware of Italo Calvino, but it's contemporaneous with it. It's a kind of subjective survey of the city and a method of making an argument. And in fact, what it really is a planner's argument in defence of not destroying a Victorian hospital. But he was struggling, like a lot of these modern architects, with history, because his ideology that he'd learnt from Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe wasn't the word of Walter Gropius and that form of Bauhaus and Harvard, but was nonetheless struggling with questions of universality within modernity, and so he's kind of beginning to read Plato, and he's looking at Enlightenment philosophy for clues to find a way for a nuanced form of modernity that could relate itself to the specificity of Irish society. And in fact, he even published an essay called An Architectural Philosophy of Architectural Design. So part of the book, it just presents these as primary historical texts. And at the same time, he's building villas for playboys, projects for public schools, the Irish Tourist Board, speculative office building, and projects for chapels. So he's absolutely involved in the creation of a modern Irish state as a teacher, as a polemicist, and as a builder. The projects look like this. You can clearly see the Miesian influence as he come back from Chicago. But as he begins to, and it is kind of a pretentious word, bed in, as it were, he builds this house for his family, which sits behind a wall in the mews at the back of a Georgian house in the south side of Dublin. So it's what would have been accommodation for horses and stables becomes this modernist family home. So the book is a combination of original John Donat's photographs and this is the dining hall, the Student Union for University College Dublin, and Sue Barr's photographs. And this is the last thing he built, which was a Roman Catholic church. In this period, he'd gone from being an Anglo-Irish Protestant gentleman to marrying the daughter and granddaughter of IRA activists, Dorothy Walker, and converted to Roman Catholicism. And so part of what I've been writing about is his friendship with Seamus Heaney, his relationship to Second Vatican Council, philosophical movements within what Paul Ricoeur was talking about as a tension between universal civilization and local culture, which and I think is a primer for what we might now call decolonization in architecture. So you think about the African states that, when they became republics, were embracing modernism as a way to discard the neoclassicism of the French or the English empires. A similar thing was going on in Ireland. The church, however, was also modernising, and the relationship between the congregation and the clergy was changing. So this is one reason why I'm now studying theology part-time, because I'm beginning a book about Marc de Sauvage, a very talented Belgian architect who taught Marie-José van Hee and Robrecht at Dam in St. Lucas Academy in Ghent. So I think what I'm picking up on and trying to get you to see, there's a kind of conversation going on. And so Tom and I talk about this all the time, because this is kind of an intriguing, strange project. It doesn't really look like much else, but it sort of looks like stuff that was contemporaneous in Porto. And then we invited Laura to participate, because she's much younger than us, and so there's a kind of check to. It's like we were kind of taught by these guys. So the question is, are we kind of still infected with their prejudices, or is this work relevant? Doug wrote a poem, and Elizabeth and Neil provided two different perspectives. So Neil was taught by Robin, and Elizabeth teaches in Limerick and teaches in Stockholm, and is a kind of insider-outsider in Irish architectural culture. The book ends with Elizabeth commenting about the relationship between ground and tectonics in the architecture. So we go from the earth and the forest to these buildings which have a a highly sophisticated relationship with the ground. And she says, at Wesley College, all corners are split open. What does that corner void do? In miniature, it creates a room where only the eye can dwell. It manifests an absence of a solid, but at Wesley the solid is still there, appearing like a kernel in a fruit, only half revealed. The gap created also implies several thin profiles when there is a window, and this softens and diffuses the form, making the construction more ambiguous. On the other hand, the split corners emphasize and reveal a thickness where it would normally be hidden. So the built fabric is both loosened up and reinforced. That very detail makes the eye interested and gives a feeling that this fabric not only holds a built object, a well-defined enclosed interior, but suggests an implied space, a room more extensive and enigmatic between built and unbuilt. It is this kind of overtone flowing over the continually repetitive and relentless geometric pattern of a building structure, like a type of architectural sprezzatura, that makes Robin Walker's architecture so different, so subtle, and so urgent. And so if the kind of conventional art historical description of the trajectory from modernism to postmodernism is that in the 1980s people rediscovered the ground and they rediscovered the Nolly plan. And up until then, the Corbusier's 5 points were effectively relegating the ground to cars or building plant. Rather than getting into arguments about style, what I've been trying to do is to actually get people to look very closely at what's actually happening, on the one hand, and secondly to consider the phrase late modernity as it's used in English literature studies. So late modernist poetry is a genre, and that's really my contribution. But what I do now is I'd like to invite Laura and Neil, but I need some help with the technology, I suspect, to tell us a bit about what they've done. I just realised, Laura, do you remember Andy Laurie was working in the office when you joined, and he said British architecture could be described very succinctly as Oedipal. That it's really good at eating its fathers and not very good at having any. Do you want to maybe come up and we could sit and...
Why don't you, if you both stand there...
we stand here, then we can talk to Neil. And... Yeah, and so Neil, I thought that description was kind of cutting from this. Andy Laurie was a student of ours who was working in the office about 15 years ago, but actually really precise, because one of the things that is remarkable about Irish architecture, in contrast, is that, well, just in practical terms, Friday afternoons, O'Donnell and Toomey, Grafton, and a host of their younger ex-students come in and teach 5 students in a thesis studio for the second semester of the final year. And it seems, when you go to Porto, for example, and most other schools of architecture with a sense of modernism as a tradition, that these cultures are not Oedipal, and that there is instead a conversation across generations and a development of architectural language. But obviously that's not without conflict and not without personal egos and a certain tension. And I think that when Robin started to teach at UCD, and Sheila and John had come back from working with James Sterling, and Sheila had been studying at the Royal College, there was a kind of generational clash where Robin's kind of tempered modernist intellect and artistic freedom was slightly at odds with a kind of dogmatic teaching method that I think we probably experienced to some degree as well when we were undergraduates, where the plan has to work and there's a kind of lag. But you tell a really funny story, Neil, about Zaha Hadid coming to give a talk at UCD, which you write about in the book. Maybe you could say a bit about that talk. I don't want to spoil the punchline because it's quite a funny joke that Robin makes, and about that experience of being a student in that world.
I mean, that comment at the end of the lecture was very like Robin. I think in public he liked to be a little bit contrarian, and I think that was part of his personality. Zaha Hadid came to speak at the National Gallery in Dublin, and it was a major public event. And Robin, at any of these lectures, would always sit right at the front, in the front row, smoking his cigar and glaring at whoever the speaker was. However, on this occasion, the world was just turning, and the National Gallery had imposed a smoking ban on the lecture theatre. So Robin sat increasingly trembling as the lecture went on, and looking more and more intense. And at the end, when the questions came up, Zaha said, does anybody mind if I smoke a cigarette while I answer the questions? And Robin just broke out of that stage and he roared, "You've broken all the rules, you might as well break this one." So that was very like Robin. I remember being at lots of lectures where he would have some amazing declaration at the end of the lecture. But I think that the conflict that you speak about, if you could call it as such, it's quite interesting if you think about it in a way, because when Robin went to Chicago, as I understand it, and most of what I know I got from Cathal O'Neill, who was professor in the school at the time, he spent less time with Mies and far more time with Hilbersheimer. And if you think about him coming from that philosophical background, it's interesting that the sort of central scene in UCD at that time was these bright young things who had come back from London, from Sterling's office and from the RCA, where they'd been studying with Ed Jones. And we had John Toomey, Sheila O'Donnell, Paul Keogh, Rachel Chidlow, Derek Tynan. And they constituted a whole extremely fashionable scene in the middle of UCD. But if you've ever read Tafuri's Boudoir Architecture, you couldn't set up a better contrast than someone who's a student of Hilbersheimer and so a group who were students of Sterling. I mean, it was absolutely perfect. And so there was a real tension between the two. I think the tension had to do with how you constitute the world of architecture at all. But I think also for Robin, it was probably, Robin was an outlier. There was something in his personality I felt that was very much a kind of, he liked to be on the periphery. And he tended to encourage students who liked to be on the periphery too. And so the idea that there was a central, deeply fashionable scene in the school meant immediately that Robin was going to be outside it and that he was going to be tutoring students who felt that they were outside it too, which is probably how I came to know him.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because one of the weird kind of situations that you get when you have a strong situation of tradition and then you allow people who are challenging it to come together with people who were the orthodoxy and then have to kind of defend their position. I think what's interesting about that is it kind of creates gaps and allows weirdness to happen. But it seems like when you were being taught by him that he just seemed to be in your essay implying that he wasn't particularly interested in creating the best students or creating students whose work was immediately obviously brilliant in terms of drawing or polemic, and that there was something else going on. Because I think what I kind of get the sense that I don't know what Laura thinks about this, but that as if we're coming kind of full circle, that we've become disenchanted with technological progress again, partly because of the climate crisis and perhaps ultimately a kind of failure of a certain Enlightenment rationalist project. And there's kind of neo-postmodernist moment occurring. But that what Robin was about, I think, it can't be pigeonholed as just old-fashioned modernism or kind of critical regionalism became adopted by Ken Frampton, obviously, and lots of academics. I think we were a bit lost at the time, tried to hook onto that. But there's actually something about universalism at play. I wonder what you think, Laura, because your essay is is different to the others because it's about personal experience of the building, and the thing that you've noticed about Boa Bui is how cheap it is, and so for example when they converted what was the ruin of a fisherman's house into a villa for a bourgeois metropolitan family, they had to put a road in to bring in the building materials, because otherwise up until then the only way in and out was via boat, and they had to dynamite the rocks in order to put a road in. So the guards were there, the police were there, because this was, bandit country, so the IRA could have come and stolen the materials. But it's built very, very, very cheaply, and yet has a nobility that alludes, and from my point of view, to a kind of universal culture, that it's actually a villa for artists and patrons and a kind of salon. But it's also just made of bits of 4x2 and rees blocks, and was built by a family of Lynches, apparently, from across the water. One brother was a carpenter, one was a bricklayer, and etc. But that's what you responded to, was the kind of visceral, physical.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Lynches, so that's a surprise.
We're at university now.
Yeah, I think that is something which is very interesting about it. I mean, the cost aspect of it, I think, is less the driver, because obviously you have this situation where you have a setting which could only have been reached by boat before, and a road has to be dynamited in, which is an extraordinarily indulgent thing to do. But so much as the ordinariness of the material. When we're talking about a part of Ireland which is still rural, but at that time was remote in its extreme. And so really they could only work with things which were available, and in the past that would have been field stones moved to make pasture land and then piled up to make a building, or taken from the shore, which is how the existing buildings there were made. But now it's about, okay, well, what's the nearest builder's merchant and what do they have? And it's all the stuff that people are building their bungalows out of. So as you say, it's just bits of 2x4 and concrete block. And actually, it's the way that those things are brought together to create really extraordinary moments within the architecture that's so engaging for me.
Yeah, and I guess, Neil, what you're suggesting is that intellectual exposure to Hilbersheimer and obviously to the other people in the Chicago school, that I guess that's my project really as a publisher, and it's a way. And what I'm trying to do is reveal that there was a degree of not just an orientation towards classical culture as style, but an orientation to the idea of culture itself as something that, even if you were building it out of rees blocks and 4x2s and sheet metal roofs, could aspire to the creation of a society based on dialogue. I guess it's that I think, as well as the fact that it's very, very cheaply built, that, and he's building University College Dublin's student union. Within the practice, they're building the Bank of Ireland. And they're basically building a modern society, these three partners. But they're also creating the conditions for discourse and dialogue. And that's the thing that I think ultimately, I can't think of any other significant architect who was best friends with a Nobel Prize winning poet or scientist. It's extraordinary.
But may I speak a little bit about that? Because I think that one of the things that's obvious to me about the relationship between Robin and Seamus is that you read the Heaney poem, which is an architect. But the Heaney poem that seems to me to be closest to both of them are the suite of poems which are called the Sweeney poems, which are about this king who was cursed and fled all human company, who was always rushing out into the woods and trying to be away. And the strongly centrifugal character that both of them share, they have this strange dual nature, two sociable people, but whose themes are so much about flight. And there's something of the anchorite about Robin. And Boa Bui seems to me to stand for that side of him, the person who's on the periphery. And it's no mistake that Sweeney rhymes with Heaney. I mean, he's a clever poet. That's not an accident. And there's such an obvious identification to me between Robin and him. And the thing I would say about seeing him in the studio and seeing him in the school and talking to him was his kind of essential loneliness, that there was something about him that wanted to be on the periphery and took pleasure by being on the periphery. And it gave him a kind of freedom to speak very, very directly without being obliged to the kind of set or the scene around him. And I think that's a very important way to see him, both situated in the buildings of Beauharbois, but also in the School of Architecture at the time. And all of the students who he kind of chose to spend time with were people who were in some way or other in their own minds on the periphery of things. And that great line from Heaney, to keep at a tangent, to keep the circle wide and stay at a tangent. I mean, if you want an architect at a tangent, it's Robin Walker, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's weird, isn't it? Because I think that what the 20th century historians did was take people at the centre, and that produced quite a flat ontology of modernism. Modernism equals technical progress, social progress via technology, etc. But what we're starting to discover, both in I think Adam and Helen are doing it admirably at Zurich as well, is that there was another history of people who were not desperate to be at the centre of things and were more interested in the ambiguities, I guess, is probably about as fair, because within there gives you freedom to freedom to make work which is highly personal, but also straining for the universality, by which I mean an audience which is not the immediate audience of one's peers. And that's why I think he and Heaney are great artists, because there's a civic dimension of engagement, but there's also a kind of desire to create space to make work in. That for me is a very strong lesson for architects. I think it's important that we don't. And for architecture students, you know, marks don't matter at architecture school. They really, really are completely irrelevant. And yet we've got used to measuring things by what other people think about things. I think what Robin does, he offers a really good example of someone who's slightly cussed and slightly at askance and at a tangent to the world. I think that's a very, very beautiful way of describing it. But then I think he's kind of where we got to. I don't know why I think that, because I think, you know, the age of being told what to do by Rayner Banham or, you know, blah 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 is probably gone, and that what we're starting to see is that the doxa of ideology and aesthetics is probably got us to a pretty bad state as a species and as a profession. And so that's why hopefully the next book about Neve Brown, if you remember, you know, kind of disappeared off the scene in the same way in which Robin did. He didn't stop being brilliant, it's just that the government changed and the society started to think that other things were more important than building housing for poor people. But we've kind of come back to that point in the tangential movement of half circles and things. Do you have anything else to add, Laura?
No, I was just going to say, I think, well, I sort of hope that you're right, that we're living in a time now where maybe we're a bit more open to marginal stories and viewpoints that come from the edge of things rather than a kind of artificially constructed centre.
I think we've fully run out of time, haven't we? Thank you. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Nate.